Without further ado, I'd like to follow up the Prime Minister. We're going to use the Keeper, the app, so yeah, it's going to be. Listen carefully.
Ever since the dawn of the new century, there's been a new concept in warfare: asymmetric warfare, on when non-combatants are no longer fighting soldier to soldier, in which combatants are no longer fighting soldier to soldier, in which there are no more formal standing armies, but rather soldiers now have to dig out every hint of the enemy through every hill, through every mountain, through every cave, through every town. And we see it justified that they do so for the following reasons. We tell you that, number one, these civilians are actively harboring, meaning that they are not being forced to take these insurgents in, they're actively letting these insurgents into their homes. That's the very definition of harboring. But secondly, we see that there's still a degree of effectivity to this policy. But thirdly, we're going to prove to you why exactly it's unjust to charge a soldier and a general for just doing his job. Now let's go on to some definitions. What exactly is an insurgent? We tell you that insurgents are people who usually fight in guerrilla warfare, where it becomes a war of attrition, when the soldiers have to dwindle the supplies of the insurgent, or the insurgent has to dwindle the supplies of a military base or civilian center in order for them to be weak enough in order for insurgency to get in there, or in order for the soldiers to get in a town. Therefore, insurgents usually fight in guerrilla warfare. They fight through asymmetric means in which they run in a civilian town, bomb it, then run out and hide in some place. They usually wait a long time before they do their actions compared to what soldiers do, which is military operations, which focus on consistent action in a certain region. Insurgents go from region to region really quickly, striking fast, striking hard, and getting out. And we tell you that it's okay for soldiers to shoot majority insurgent towns, because if the very tactics of insurgency is to move quickly and move quickly and hard from town to town, we tell you that we cannot afford to lose any time before they can move on, before they can grab another strategic position, and before they can capture more civilians. But secondly, what is a war crime? We tell you that war crimes are three things. First, they cause undue suffering that goes beyond the war. What are examples? Chlorine gas, carpet bombing, cluster bombing. Because way beyond the war, you could still feel the ill effects of chlorine gas. You could still feel the ill effects of losing a leg. And secondly, war crimes are indiscriminate, which means that you fire upon civilians just for the malice out of the civilians, or the malice to society, or the malice from being a soldier. These are indiscriminate firings. But thirdly, that means that they are indistinguishable. What does this mean? Combatants cannot be separated from non-combatants, therefore you just fire at will, fire gung-ho. Now, we tell you that there's also a principal difference between harboring. What is harboring? Willingly letting the enemy into your home, possibly actively giving them supplies, or if not, the very principle of negligence in doing so, even if you think it was the best of your ability, the very negligence on which you see your neighbor letting an insurgent into his home and you do nothing about it, that is also considered harboring, and that in and of itself is treasonous to a state that only seeks to do the best for you. And we tell you that there's also a difference between being forced to do so, because you're being held at gunpoint, they could kill your family, etc. Yes?
Do you think there's a moral distinction between believing in the political project that insurgents fight for and therefore harboring them, and choosing to pick up arms to kill other civilians?
Yes, we tell you that so long as you believe in these ideals of the insurgents, these insurgents can grow stronger. So long as you believe in their cause, so long as you can see what they stand for, then we tell you that's still an insurgency. So let's go on to my first argument. I'm going to prove to you why it's justified to shoot these civilians, right? We recognize in a war that we can bomb industrial complexes. We recognize in a war that we can bomb ships that are carrying civilians and soldiers alike on sea. Because we tell you that no matter what these civilians do, so long as they are they still contribute in a way, for they are harboring these insurgents. What does this mean? If you were to bomb a factory in a wartime, even if the factory had innocent factory workers, we still see it as a part of the military-industrial complex and therefore the military strength of these insurgents. And we recognize that this is one key way to take away that military power, therefore it is justified. We also recognize that in a war, there will always be civilian casualties. But it is not always about just wanting to shoot civilians. It is also about wanting to deprive the resources of these insurgents in any means possible, and that's okay, right? Because we recognize that if a soldier shoots a civilian, it's not necessarily his fault. It's done out of the spur of the moment. He knows that any insurgent could be hiding in the next corner. He knows that his life could be ended in the next minute or so. Therefore, there is that degree of irrationality, and we cannot charge a soldier for acting out of the spur of the moment. We cannot charge a soldier for just doing his job, that is contributing to the war effort. What we can do, however, is actually recognize that sometimes it's okay to take away the necessary resources through any means possible, because number one, the soldier contributes to the war effort, but number two, you take away the capability of these insurgents to actually go out, to actually strike hard and fast more. In fact, you send them a message that they can no longer use civilians as their shield, etc., etc. But secondly, let's say a town is not at all majority sympathizers. Let's say there are some non-sympathizers. Why is it okay to shoot the non-sympathizers? We see it on two levels. First, because there's an unjust benefit. We recognize that insurgents can get money through illicit means, probably like selling guns, selling drugs, using their services for hire, etc., etc. Therefore, we tell you that these towns may unjustly benefit for the funds that go into these insurgencies, and that's still an unjust benefit at the end of the day. You're getting benefit from the suffering of others. But secondly, if they did not unjustly benefit, we tell you that it's still an act of negligence. What does that mean? It is a negligence to the state. It is a negligence to the situation. It is a negligence to your very own town. We tell you that if you do whatever it takes to, try to drive these insurgents out, we tell you that it's still negligent in a sense, because you were not able to rile up a necessary force, or and if you were truly wanted to contribute to the war effort, you would side with soldiers, etc., etc. But third, we tell you that these soldiers did it to the best of their ability, and we tell you that number one, it's indistinguishable to differ a civilian from an insurgent, therefore it's hard to tell. But secondly, there's always going to be collateral, and it's really hard to determine, like I said, in the spur of the moment, and the soldier isn't actively going against a malice for society. He's just doing his job, and he's not actively wanting to commit treason and or a war crime. He just wants to contribute to the war effort. We shouldn't punish him for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now calling upon the Leader of Opposition.
It was significant that government today chose to take the stance that there is no moral distinction between an actor who takes up arms and is violent against non-combatants and combatants alike, and an actor who merely supports the ideology of that project. I expect the government bench to be consistent on this throughout this debate, because what they mean is there is no difference between civilians and military personnel in a situation of war. If you're a civilian in, say, South Korea, supporting, presumably because you vote for the Korean government and so on and so forth, you are a legitimate target because you support the political project of South Korea. Same goes for North Korean civilians. That is extended to insurgents, right? In a case where insurgency is a political project, as long as you believe in that political project, to the extent to which you are not willing to give up your livelihood, to like throw people out of your house and so on and so forth, even if they may be your loved ones and they believe things that are slightly different from you, you are equally morally culpable. These guys do not understand the distinction between civilian and combatant that makes up much of international law surrounding war crimes. No. War crimes don't have to be indiscriminate and lasting, in the sense that these guys are like, it is wrong to charge a soldier for war crimes because he accidentally shot a civilian in the spur of the moment. No, the standard use is that soldiers have to pass a due diligence test. You have to you have to prove to a military tribunal or like International Court of Justice tribunals that you thought you were shooting at a combatant, that perhaps they might have put on uniforms, or you might have sensed fire coming from a direction. And these are all mitigating factors that can either reduce your sentence or get you off the charge altogether. So the point here is soldiers have to try to make a distinction between someone who is a legitimate target and someone who is not, and there's a moral distinction between the two. But why is that moral distinction important? Because at the end of the day, fighting wars is about protecting people. There is no point in fighting winning the war if there is no one left to be protected at the end of the day. Note that the principle behind that they stand for means that if all civilians become legitimate targets at the end of the day, the end state of wars between nations is that like just everyone is annihilated because everyone is fair game for them. That's terrible. I want to talk about three things in my speech. Firstly, I want to talk about insurgency as a political project that requires a political solution. Secondly, I want to talk about the consequences this gives to the rules of engagement. And finally, if I have time, why this diminishes the idea of what a war crime is and why that is important. Okay, firstly on insurgency. It's really funny that you come up and tell us that asymmetric warfare is a 21st century concept. That is not true. Armies have a lot of experience in fighting asymmetric campaigns. Like just three quick examples: the IRA's struggles in Ireland, the Viet Cong in Vietnam, Israel-Palestine has been going on for probably longer than since the turn of the century. The point here, though, is that most of the time, in cases of insurgents, you have a militarily superior force, a politically superior force that defines certain groups of people as illegitimate, that their views are illegitimate because we disagree with the freedom they want. Or most primarily, these governments say their actions are illegitimate, even if their views aren't, because they choose to target non-combatants, because they choose to target civilians. But note that in many cases, insurgents do have a political project that people subscribe to. See the IRA fighting for the liberation of Ireland, see Palestinians, the PLO fighting for the liberation of Palestine, and so on and so forth. Note also that the degree of complicity that these guys point to scales with the legitimacy of their political project. What do I mean by this? It means that you are more likely to invite an insurgent into your home and actively harbour him if you also genuinely believe that political project has legitimacy, which is why the IRA had a lot of support from Irishmen, and which is why ISIS in general doesn't have a lot of support from the territories it holds or conquers, because ISIS is an apocalyptic project that no one can subscribe to. What this means is, in the instances where insurgency is legitimately a political project, what you do by saying that as long as you're a civilian who happens to be in the geographical vicinity of suspected insurgents, then you too are an insurgent, that you too deserve to be killed, which means that the state can deem entire political projects illegitimate and use excessive force against that project itself, and not just the members of that project who choose to be violent. Why is that damaging? Well, firstly, you are invalidating an entire political project. You need to negotiate with these perceived terrorists if you want to reach some kind of resolution to the insurgency, as opposed to saying your project is untenable, we will not give you an inch on anything, which means the conflict becomes intractable, and you end up just having to kill a large proportion of your own population in order to resolve the problem, because you've deemed anyone who fights in the interest of that political project an enemy. That's probably bad. Secondly, in the cases where you are talking about like projects with no legitimacy, like ISIS, most of these time people are coerced into harboring these terrorists. They do it at the barrel of the gun, which suggests that the complicity is low. In that case, you are literally just shooting innocents. These innocents are often oppressed themselves by these insurgents. We think it's damaging to find them morally guilty in this instance. But finally, often the invalidation of political projects or insurgents comes with racial or religious tones. So often people are fighting for these what they believe because they are otherized, because they are already racially discriminated against. the model on the side government basically says that as long as you are a supporter or someone who looks like these people, then you are equally morally complicit. That's damaging because you alienate an entire people, again making the conflict really difficult to end. Before I go on closing.
Does the US drone operator commit a war crime when he strikes the compound of Al-Qaeda's #1, even while knowing that his wife also resides there?
No, because the US has just defined the Al-Qaeda #1's wife as a literally priority target who has a intimate knowledge of that person and so on and so forth. But I think in the instance where these people are entirely innocent, we're happy to say that is a war crime, we ought to be charged, and we don't stand for drone strikes and things like that. That's entirely consistent with what we do. What do you do to the rules of engagement? Firstly and importantly, their side legitimates collateral damage entirely, which is to say, if you can now say that deliberately targeting civilians, say for example if they are human shields or if they're just inconvenient and in the way, is not a war crime, then obviously you can't say that collateral damage is damaging, which means that it becomes convenient and easy for militaries to use that sort of indiscriminate tactic to bomb entire cities rather than attempt to be targeted. To use, instead of drone strikes that target one person, instead of killing like the 50 civilians on the streets, to use larger bombs because they are more effective. That kills more people. That's probably bad. But secondly, it leads to and in line with that, it leads to a policy of over-aggression, when in the pursuit of military outcomes, you forget the fact that every single civilian you kill probably strengthens the effort and the beliefs that sustain the insurgency, because people generally don't like their friends and family and people they find to be in the same community to be killed indiscriminately, which means you embolden the insurgency and so on and so forth. You make the conflict intractable because you alienate an entire population. You say that their beliefs are illegitimate, you rule out the possibility for a solution.
Thanks, Speaker. Now I invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh, sure. It's good to do the video next one.
You find it. Mr. Chair, the thing that the opening opposition got so wrong about the case isn't that we just have a problem with the type of political opinions that these people have, but rather that we have a problem on the way they try to get these political opinions through and the way they get these political opinions across. They try to frame it as so that we're trying to alienate a certain group of society who disagrees with the state. No, we see that's completely unreasonable. We tell you that the nuance with insurgencies and people who just vote for a different political party is the type of actions insurgencies do just to achieve their kind of goal. My partner made it very clear to you. The type of actions that they try to do to achieve this goal are bombing schools, bridges, acts of terrorism, just so that they can get their political message across so that they can convince the society. So we think it's unjust. So we think even in their circumstance, where they say we're trying to alienate a political view, we still say that's somehow principally justified because we're not typically trying to alienate the kind of whatever values they have, whether that be about increased autonomy or increased liberalism or whatever they might believe in, but rather the thing that we're really trying to suppress on government side is the way they do it and the way they use violence to try and achieve their goals. We see as the state, that there needs to be the ability to protect actors. Like I said, war is supposed to be protecting people, so you need to intervene as the state to make sure that the kind of way we engage in political rhetoric is something that's more peaceful even through the use of force. Now into some more formal rebuttals. What were the other things that the leader of opposition tried to pull on us on today's debate? Aside from the idea that we were going to harm political ideologies in general, he had two other ideas in his speech. Number one, how you're going to actually create this on race lines, because typically things like rebellions or insurgencies are going on an oppressed group of society, and therefore you're just going to alienate that society even more. Then secondly, he told us about how warfare would evolve when you don't consider this a war crime, where you're going to have bigger bombs and bigger weapons. Let's go into the first idea about how they said you're going to create a problem with racialized society. First of all, we see that there's a fundamental difference and there's going to be a problem that you're going to create. We tell you that if you're just going to keep letting the society hold on to these insurgencies, then it just further entrenches these insurgencies to the kind of to the kind of premise and the kind of identity that the society has. For example, like in the examples that they said, like the IRA. Once people started letting the IRA into their homes, people started feeling a greater connection to the people that they let in. They were starting to be humanized. They were starting to be, they were starting to be humanized, but even though they were humanized, it just justified the war even more and continued their extent until they started bombing London and the UK government was forced to concede. But rather we see that the success of the IRA was not due to their own military arm, but to the political arm that was able to create agreements within the country, not from military force, from other things. Meaning that the best way that we can possibly deal with the situation is not by allowing force to continue to propagate, but instead just going into direct negotiation with these people and trying to suppress these insurgencies by making sure that they have as little of a connection to the community as possible. Okay, so let's go on to the second idea that he said when he talked about how you're gonna have increased weapons of war and we're gonna start bombing cities because now it's no longer gonna be considered a war crime to bomb civilians. First of all, we see that this is really unlikely. Well, if you're considering a war effort in general, you don't want to bomb your own country. There's still gonna be a kind of reasonability within a military higher staff where you're gonna be targeted to certain people like drone strikes. But secondly, even if it is true that we're gonna start bombing civilians with bigger bombs, we're willing to bite the bullet. And here's why. Like my partner said, he made it very clear. The thing about supporting a terrorist and giving them food and weapons is like the same way we interact with other countries during war, right? When you have the capability to feed that country's war, to feed your opponent's war effort through, let's say, building guns in a factory or even producing canned goods for the war effort, even though you have no direct effort into contributing into the war, aside from just your capability to produce goods, the fact that you produce goods, this means that the state recognizes that you then are an integral part of the war and forfeit your right to forfeit your right to alienation. Now onto more formal arguments. I'm going to talk about how warfare has changed and why it's particularly justified when it comes to insurgencies as a whole. We have to talk about how war crimes were created, when they were created, and what kind of wars they were created for to begin with. But sure.
So your team seems to suggest that because these civilians are involved somehow in conspiracy with armed insurgents, they are guilty. But your model criminalizes them on basis of proximity, not on actual involvement. Why is that fair?
Well, first of all, my partner said it in his speech. There's already the people who are supporting it, the people in the center, and the people around them, even if in circumstances where they didn't support that, let's say, localized group, the fact that they didn't report it to the state, kick that person out of the community, just shows that these people are complicit or at least negligent in the kind of atrocities that these insurgencies are creating at the end of the day. So back on this idea, why were war crimes created? Most war crimes are based off of the Geneva Convention, which happened after World War II. The kind of wars that they were trying to specify were things where two major powers would implicitly engage each other with tanks and more formalized rules of war, so that each side wouldn't commit atrocities to its own civilians. But we see that's a fundamentally different circumstance from the circumstances of wars we're dealing in the 21st century and maybe even in the Viet Cong or in the IRA. We tell you that the simple fact of the matter is that those wars are no longer feasible, and if we do, those wars are no longer feasible, and there's simply a disparity and opportunity cost. What is the disparity? The disparity is simple. We tell you that this is the kind of war we're talking about, where we are forced to, that we as the state are following so many formalized rules of combatants, slowing our capability to actually stop this insurgency, while comparatively, this insurgency has the capability to do whatever it wants without regulation until the state can stop them and bring them to justice. What are these types of things? Like I said before, bombing schools, bombing buildings, just so that they can get their political message out at the end of the day. So what does this show? Number one, it shows a kind of illegitimacy, it shows a kind of illegitimacy on their side, where they're already making war crimes as is, and therefore they should be punished for it. But since we as the state cannot punish for them, since we as the state simply cannot just go there and arrest them without the capability of, let's say, information, without the capability of information, they then become complicit and roam free while committing these crimes. So then it's just to find any kind of justice, or at least find a way to stop them from committing these kinds of war crimes, like creating bombs in the future. But secondly, it's about opportunity cost. What happens if we continue to allow these terrorists to live, these insurgencies to live throughout the long term? We tell you that all we're really doing is prolonging this conflict in which the net benefit on the amount of lives lost and the people suffering will tip the scales. What kind of harm are we talking about? If we let this go maybe 10 years, it might not be a problem. But when we talk about really long-term conflicts, like ones in the Middle East, that last 50 or 60 years, which then create huge amounts of loss for every single community, whether supporting that society or not, which is an even greater travesty than just trying to end this war quickly. With that, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Now calling upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
The problem on the outside of the house is that they don't understand what exactly it's like to be a civilian when an insurgent is invading your hometown. But also, they seem to presume that insurgencies are just a finite number of people that continue to propagate certain atrocities onto the state, and as a result, if the state is able to get rid of this X number of people, therefore the problem is over. That's not the case. Insurgencies are oftentimes the embodiment of a certain idea, which is to say that they oftentimes have legitimate political grievances that they're actually fighting for. Which means that just because you can remove a certain number of insurgents from the world, when the actions to remove those particular insurgents means that you inspire other people to take up the mantle of that political ideology, you're doing nothing whatsoever to actually fix the problem. So I think that on their side, it is quite simplistic for them to presume that somehow simply killing everybody involved in the situation, even the civilians, is going to somehow solve the problem. We don't think that's the case. Let's first deal with this idea of complicity, because what exactly did they tell us? They told us a multitude of reasons, getting sketchier and sketchier as they went on, about why exactly the individuals who led these terrorists or insurgents into their house are complicit. Firstly, they told us there could be just direct proximity or direct involvement in the insurgency. But the fact of the matter is that there's absolutely no way for us to actually find out. To the extent to which you're simply saying that they have just led the terrorists into their house or led the insurgents to their house, how exactly can you prove whether or not these people have had an active involvement in the insurgency? And more importantly, I think they never dealt with the principal distinction that we told you on our side, which is to say that as an individual who is a civilian, there is a difference between allotting a space in your house for a person to be able to stay versus you actually taking up the arms and personally shooting that gun against a member of the state. And that distinction is crucial because oftentimes if you allow for the idea that anything that you do can be considered to be involvement, then you also open up the fact that anyone who exists in a country is somehow directly linked in the involvement of the continuation of a war. So if I was an individual that lived in the United States, for example, and worked and contributed to the economy, I'm producing money to fund the war machinery. Literally, there's an argument as to why we should be allowed to shoot any civilian that we wanted to in the war. And via the language they talked about, that is also true. The second thing they told us was that, well, you are complicit because you didn't report this to the state. But how are you going to do that? If it is true that these insurgents are so terrifying and have guns and bombs and the like, as a civilian that is in a town that is majority besieged by these insurgents, how will you have the ability to risk your life and the lives of your family in order to report this to the state? I think it's an incredibly unfair burden for you to place on these individuals, that if an insurgent comes to your town, either you die at the hands of the insurgent or you die at the hands of the state. Both cases are incredibly unjust and just not the way that we think principles of wars ought to be upheld. So we don't think this complicity argument is necessarily something that is justified on their side of the house. But secondly, they told us this will actually solve the war effort. Recognize that if we win the principle argument, we've already won the debate. And the reason why is very simple. Because at the end of the day, and I'll talk about this more later, war is about how you go about using the rules of engagement in warfare, which is to say that even though we recognize war to sometimes be a legitimate and necessary part of the human condition, we also recognize that because it's a heinous thing, we need to be able to create rules that are able to govern the use of violence in this context. To the extent to which there are problems that might exist in the world, the fact of the matter is that we don't do anything that we want in order to have the problem. The principle of allowing war in the first place is the fact that we can regulate it. So we think that we've already won that principle argument. But secondly, they told us this will solve the problem. Let's compare the two strategies. On their side, they want to bomb and kill everybody involved so that you can take out all the insurgents. But firstly, and then they told us that this was problematic because now the humanization of these insurgents is a problem because more people will want to help out these insurgencies. I think that the converse is true, which is to say that when you treat insurgents in this particular manner and you kill civilians who are innocent in the war, what's more likely to happen is that you inspire individuals to take up the insurgents' cause. Because what insurgents tend to do is they try to provoke that same disproportionate response from the state so that you're able to induce sympathy for the insurgency cause, and that's how you recruit more people towards your cause in the first place. But secondly, oftentimes insurgents also have very legitimate political grievances and are often the victims of oppression within the state, things that they never actually wanted to deal with, which is to say that the state paints them as insurgents and they're oftentimes pushed into a corner to use violence the last possible means necessary. At a point at which the state shows that they are happy to use violence, not just against the minority, but to anybody who could potentially be helping these particular insurgents, that means that you ossify the fact that this is going to be a continued and perpetuated violent conflict against this particular minority, and you create more sympathies for them where people are more willing to see that political cause as legitimate because the state is seen to be the illegitimate actor in this situation. In the comparative, we gave you a very good solution, which is to say that even if it was true that more people were likely to support the insurgency, we think that's a good thing. Firstly, we think that allows for expedited political negotiations to happen with the state. The same thing that they told us about the IRA, where individuals were able to humanize the fact that the Protestants were not actually just like crazy violent people, but rather individuals that wanted to write their religion respected. That's what allowed for the negotiations of a ceasefire to happen between the state and the insurgents. In a world in which you kill civilians in order to target those insurgents, you only make the conflict escalate and cause it to continue into perpetuity. But also we wanted to tell you that this has knock-on effects that are terrible for the rest of warfare as a whole. So this is the part that they didn't deal with, which is that it's not just about the singular conflict that you're talking about right now. It is also about how exactly we are able to portray ourselves and submit to certain rules of engagement in war as a whole. So firstly, we argue that war crimes, and I'll take you just a second, let me just finish the sentence. War crimes need to be set as moral norms, but before I move on to explain what that means,
Ma'am, it's also about competence, the thing that you're getting. If we allow these terrorists to continue to propagate within this village, how does that portray the state as an incompetent actor who can't deal with their own rebels?
It's not a problem of incompetency. If these insurgents force their way into the area, then it is respect for your civilians' lives, not incompetency. If you actually killed them, that's not competency, that's just heartlessness, right? I don't understand why that's important, right? So war crimes need to be seen to be moral norms, and to the extent to which we recognize that the entire nature of war and the way that a soldier is forced to make certain decisions is oftentimes done in areas that are incredibly morally grey, where split-second decisions have to be made all the time. The issue then, therefore, is that we need to drill into these soldiers very simplistic ideas of what is right and wrong, which is to say, never shoot a civilian is the kind of thing that we need to ensure that every soldier is willing to understand, and therefore that becomes the kind of rules that allows them to engage in warfare. At the point at which you dilute the simplicity of those rules, which is to say, sometimes you can shoot civilians if statistically 51% of them are actually insurgents, it becomes very difficult, and you actually tell these people that there might be legitimate loopholes in which they can shoot those civilians. That's incredibly problematic, not just because it allows for certain abuses of power and loopholes in the court of law, but also because soldiers find it difficult to make those snap-second decisions at a point at which they are besieged by war and the stresses of conflict. But lastly, we also think that this creates the dilution of the ability to call anything else war crime. So for instance, if you say that torture is only defined by X number of sets of rules, but some things that could cause pain may not be considered to be war crimes, this denigrates your ability to call these other things war crimes as well, because that means that now you don't have clear rules of engagement, you don't have a principle standing to stand on. We're very happy to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I'll open up the back half. Invite a member of government to proceed.
Judge, ready? The second the Afghan village took in the Taliban, fed them, willingly clothed them, willingly told them where the US soldiers were, willingly gave them ammunition, willingly gave them places to stay and sleep, they directly turned their homes into military bases that are legitimate targets. I don't think team government today, opposition today, clearly understands what harboring is. We're not talking about regular civilians here, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about individuals that directly identify with the opposing cause and have turned their homes into safe houses. And in modern warfare, Mr. Speaker, every place is not off limits. In this speech, I'm going to do three things. Firstly, I'm going to go over the key assumption on their side of the house, which is what is a harboring civilian. Then I'm going to go into the 2 points of contention. Firstly, which side wins the war? Secondly, is this ever moral? Then I'm going to go into my third argument and tell you why their side actually dilutes the definition of a war crime when you put this on the same pedestal as crimes like genocide. Firstly, the main assumption that their side of the house made was a harboring civilian versus a regular civilian. We asked them a very clear point of information. What does it mean when you would be willing to shoot an Al-Qaeda's #1's wife, which is an actual scenario that happened, Mr. Speaker. A United States drone operator shot on a compound with Al-Qaeda's #1 and his wife. They made a massive concession here. They said that wouldn't be a war crime, contradicting the very point they said, which is we wouldn't shoot at civilians, contradicting their very principles, which is how do you know the wife wasn't coerced to marry that dude? Number two, how do you know she isn't just another civilian who's just going out her business? Do you seriously think any wives want to marry those Al-Qaeda dudes, Mr. Speaker? And I would say no, they look really bad. But Mr. Speaker, we would also contend that they don't understand that they made a massive principle concession because it sounds bad, but at the end of the day, it's not a just war, it's just war. Then go into the main points of contention. First, Firstly, can we ever win a war on their side of the house? We ask you the question, are villages on our side of the house versus their side of the house more willing or likely to harbor these terrorists? We would contend and submit to you that oftentimes villagers make a calculated decision in war. Will we take in these individuals or will we try to push them back? They make a calculus based on whether or not there will be certain consequences if they harbor these individuals or not. The problem, and this is in real life too, Mr. Speaker. In fact, an Afghan village fought off the Taliban while harboring a wounded United States soldier, which is very much portrayed in a Hollywood movie as well. The problem is, that's the kind of world you don't create. In your world, you make it much more likely that the villagers will not harbor those individuals because of the consequences of not harboring those individuals versus harboring them. We win those villagers because we make it a lot more likely that they realize there will be consequences to harboring forces like ISIS. Make it a lot more likely that they understand there will be consequences to harboring forces like Taliban. Second point of contention, in this point of contention, before I move on, actually, no thank you, I'll take one from closing later on. But we also told you on our side of the house that they also told you soldiers are made more complacent. That actually John the US Marine went into Afghanistan because he really wanted to shoot a civilian, but it's a much more harder to go in and kill a civilian when there's a US war crime there. No, Mr. Speaker, that's not actually what happens. Their side makes it a lot more likely that US soldier dies. Like, I don't think they know how war works. War is not where a US Marine goes around and reads Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace while talking to his commanding officer about, should I kill the civilian or not, Mr. Commanding Officer? It doesn't work like that. Before I move on, yes, ma'am.
So your comparative is just to bomb everyone because that's...
No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that we're going to make it a lot easier for soldiers to make calculated strategic decisions because we recognize that the only way to win wars against insurgencies is with quick and overwhelming force to give you a quick negotiating position. We would also contend that in many instances you create a chilling effect. We recognize that it's very easy to create a very vague definition on their side of the house. What does it mean to kill a civilian willingly? What does that mean? It's very unclear. The model is not very clear-cut on their side of the house. That means on the next time a US soldier is in the war field, that split-second decision in which he very well might get shot, he's unable to take that shot, unable to save his life, you're making those jobs a lot more dangerous for them. Secondly, is this moral? They said that you presume that these insurgencies are finite numbers of people, that they'll expand because these insurgents get a lot more angrier when you actually kill them. Political negotiations are necessary. Mr. Speaker, that's an argument for diplomacy. At the point at which the war has already begun, the commander-in-chief has already made the determination that we cannot negotiate with those insurgents because they are non-negotiable with. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we would contend that you can defeat insurgencies a lot better when you attack with overwhelming force from the beginning because you can quickly overwhelm their negotiating power. Like we see this with the IRA. There's a false dichotomy. It's not negotiation or war. It turns out when you have quick overwhelming force and you destroy a lot of their forces, your negotiating position gets a lot better. So it's a lot better on our side of the house. We think that for Western liberal democracies, a long drawn-out war, which is what they have on their side of the house, is a lot better for the insurgents. Those insurgents are fanatics that will keep fighting versus Western liberal democracies that have to cater to the needs of their citizens who say, get out of the war, I don't want to see my son come back with no limbs. That's another unique harm on their side, and that's why our side as a Western liberal democracy is much more able to win that war in a quick show of overwhelming force. That's the false dichotomy on their side. Third, an extension. Their side dilutes the definition of a war crime. The thesis of this extension is that opposition side dilutes what a war crime is and makes it harder to win wars in the modern era. Not just the 1960s, the modern era. Wars today are fought on increasingly hastily, and it's become necessary to redefine what war is. For example, the new definition means that this is no longer musket men lining up and shooting each other, but this is in very actual villages and urban areas. The problem is war crimes have been created. The definition of a war crime was created post-World War II, right? With the Nuremberg trials in many cases to prosecute people like Goering and Hitler. The problem is war has changed from then. How has it changed? The problem is their side of the house assumes that all war crimes are the same. They're placed on equal pedestals. So then, it was very hard to justify killing a civilian and very hard to justify genocide. Today, it's a lot harder to justify genocide than justify killing a civilian because he was harboring those individuals. The problem is when you put those things on relatively similar pedestals, you make it a lot more dangerous because you dilute the definition of what a war crime is. These situations where you have to kill civilians that are harboring these terrorists is a lot more common than in the past. That's why, for example, we're very angry when an actor uses the word rape very lightly, because we think that when he uses that word lightly, it dilutes the significance for actual rape victims. Their side does the same with the word war crime. That's dangerous, Mr. Speaker, because you trivialize it and you make it a lot less likely that people will take it much more significantly. You make it so that people who try to fight war crimes, people who try to seek out war crimes, are laughed off as people that don't really understand what a war crime is. You make it so that people who would have been deterred by the word war crime in the past now see it as something that's committed by hundreds of thousands every single day. We are very proud to propose, Mr. Speaker, because we understand what war is and understand what it takes to win one. Thank you.
Thank the member of government. Now calling upon the member of opposition.
At the end of this debate, the purpose is to determine how best we can combat warfare. In other words, how there are regulations in the status quo and they could be well kept. The government's bench plan is as follows. Basically, when you have a village that obviously has no governmental support, that is often isolated, that is often coerced and perhaps bribed by protection, by saying that, you know what, when other foreign soldiers come into your village, we will be the ones defending you off. When there are helpless people in the village, harboring them not out of taste, but possibly out of survival, you're basically saying, well, we can use an overwhelmed power and therefore wipe them completely off. It's not a more calculated choice that the government bench is making, but rather they're taking away that careful calculus away, making war easier, making civilians' death more possible, and at the end of the day, creating war even to a more atrocious event than it already is. Before moving on to our own extension, I'm going to deal with what Nicholas has brought. Because Nicholas' conclusion to his extension is this. We can only win if we combat with an overwhelming power. To what extent is this overwhelming power? Because we acknowledge that warfare has changed as well. We acknowledge that no longer is insurgents just being led by a small group of people, but once that you continue on your ideology, you market your ideology even on social media these days. Therefore, it's cutting off a lizard's tail just because you cut off X number of people in a village that were possibly harboring insurgents. It's a continual process. And furthermore, there's backlash when you obviously bomb an entire village. It's not like the other village down the street harboring 10 more insurgents are going to look at the situation and say, oh, we're too scared, therefore we'll fight them. Guess what, Nicholas? It was a movie because that rarely happens. Your ideal version of a war is basically leaving already desperate people who are fighting for their survival to say, no, 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 be brave, go fight against the Taliban. That's not an ideal facet of warfare, and if that's their expectation at the end of the day, I'm sorry, but they're losing. But furthermore, they keep on telling us that, oh, you're diluting the idea of war. No, you're diluting the idea of war because you're making it easier by equating civilians to those that are involved. You're pretty much saying that once you're part of a nation, be it by ideology, be it by proximity, be it because guess what, you're about to die unless you let them in, you're the same. The value of war, or rather the value of regulating war, is because we never demean the meaning of a life. If you are defenseless and if you are not part of the very gun that's shooting another person, you are not at fault and you deserve to be protected because you have dignity. That is the very basic principle of how war can be regulated, and they're the ones who are abusing that. So let's go into our extension. The CEO is going to enter this debate and talk to you about how it's immoral to allow the government bench to stand because it basically allows war to be a game of anything and everything. But furthermore, about how that degrades and regresses the progress that humanity has made over watching warfare. No. Now, when we talk about a lack of informed choice, it depends on the protection of the very individuals you want to liberate. Because guess what? When you as soldiers are going into Middle East to fight against ISIS, your main purpose isn't to just wipe out ISIS. The background of that, or the premise of that, is you one day want to liberate the very nation that you're going into. But guess what? Now you're equating the ones who are causing the ruckus and the ones who happen to just birth lottery, be there. And guess what? Be in destitute situations. That ultimately is immoral because what is it? Those who cannot defend themselves deserve to be protected. That's a principle that we abide by even as decades across after world wars, the Vietnam Wars, the Iraq Wars, and whatnot. But furthermore, the creation of your policy basically goes back to the Middle Ages, where it was basically burn the soil, right? Once you attack a village, make sure nobody's there, nobody's alive, and that's how you conquer war. We're better than that, sir. We're better than that because of the various conventions and legislature that international community has come onto. But unfortunately, regardless of our progress, we still have difficulties charging leaders who conducted genocide. We still have difficulties understanding and recognizing that many women and children were abused sexually or otherwise exploited by war leaders. We still have difficulties on that, but we're progressing. However, once now you allow war crime to be a very low bar, because now you have the authority and the justification to shoot down an entire village out of the fact that they were simply nearby these people. The fact of the matter is you make it even harder for war crimes to be charged. You make it even less meaningful for war to be punished, because now it is that all's fair in war. But all's fair in war doesn't fly in this particular debate, because they still haven't managed to prove how their solution or mechanism actually works. If your net benefit of solving war is to wipe out Village A, sure, they win this debate. Unfortunately, that's not how 21st century wars are fought. That when you cut off that tail of Village A, Village B, C, D are not going to be combatants and come back to you defending liberty and democracy. They're going to be the ones continue to be threatened for their very livelihood, continue to support even further, especially when we're talking about terrorist rhetoric that's not based on, that seems radical as is, but it's primarily based on shared beliefs and common beliefs that the Western blue-eyed monster is out to get us and that we must bandwagon together. You're feeding right into the rhetoric of recruitment officers that tell you that you must feed us, you must allow us to use your house and become your family members, because at the end of the day, the enemy is out there. You actually dilute the conversation, you actually strengthen the very organization that you're trying to defeat. Yes?
Do soldiers want to kill civilians?
We hope they don't, but like you said, war is crazy. But we tell you that we want more regulations, more calculus in check, when you understand that killing a civilian is wrong. Because surely the government bench also recognizes that's a basic principle when it comes to fighting warfare. But what you're basically doing is giving a blank check to governments that already have more technology, more weapons, to say that there's no need for you to distinguish the very people in this village, because at the end of the day, they're all the same. They're all the same. Rhetoric is what makes wars last longer, because that's the most powerful ideology you can sell, not only on the insurgent side, but also on the very government that's entering in. They're all the same is what allows us to become dehumanized. They're all the same is what allows us to throw atomic bombs on other countries. That very rhetoric and narrative is what we've been fighting for in this century, so that war is not easy, that war is more than just becoming a winner, that there are obvious losers regardless of what their association is to the belief that you have. So if you want to liberate those people, stand on opposition.
Thank you, member of opposition. I'll call upon the government whip speaker.
May I begin? The problem with closing opposition is that they focus on whether it's moral to wipe out that particular village or not. They don't take into consideration the fact that other villages are going to make certain calculations, that the army and the government is now going to make certain calculations. What do we mean by this? We think that at the point that governments understand that any village is particularly a ground in which warfare can happen, in which civilians that can harbor citizens are going, in which civilians that harbor insurgents are going to be damaged, we think it's in the incentive of the government and the army to ensure that these are the villages that are going to ideologically agree with us, that these are the villages that are going to help us when we come to them, that these are the villages that want to help us when we come. We think this is a unique contribution closing government is going to bring. Because we think not only is it easier for us to win wars, but we think on the comparative, chances are villages are going to have to make decisions in modern warfare. We think we make that
decision much more easier. So I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, war crimes and the definition of them, the morality of them, the basic principle in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the consequences of government team and why we get like better wars, although that's somehow difficult to say. So firstly, war crimes. I think we generally agree on why we basically have the concept of war crimes. That we need to fight wars better, that wars are inevitably going to be damaging, but if they are going to be damaging, we want to mitigate the damage. What the entire op-ed fails to understand is that in order for those decisions to be made, there will have to be stakes. They're simply saying, well, we're going to be able to protect everyone, when that is not the case. We think this is basically a problem in which certain sacrifices have to be made in order to mitigate the damage that is happening. So how do we mitigate the damage? Let's look over some unique contributions on closing on government. Firstly, we think that civilians, not only do civilians have less incentive to harbor war criminals, as opening government already said, but we think that it's in the incentive of the government and the army to make sure that the villages that haven't already been engaged in war don't get engaged in war further, that they go into there and protect them, to make sure that they are not going to harbor like enemy combatants. We think that makes the position for enemy combatants and insurgents much, much harder, because now they recognize that if you go into whatever village there is, chances are these are already dominated by the government and the army, and you can't do much about that. We think it creates an incentive on the behalf of government to protect these particular villages. Secondly, we think that civilians lose any meaning as a tactical tool that can be used by insurgents. Why is that the case? Because oftentimes, even if we bite the bullet and accept their characterization and say the civilians have no will to fight in the war, chances are that means that enemy combatants and insurgents will go into these particular villages and use them as human tools, use them as human shields to make sure that the government does not attack them further. We think this is particularly problematic because you have to understand the civilians are going to be involved in war, and we think that this does not leave civilians with much choice as to what they can do in these particular wars. We think rather, insurgents go into these particular villages not just because of the food, not just because they want to convince more people, but also because these civilians have value and meaning to the government, that they can be used as tools for treaties, negotiations, and blackmail. We think that this creates a morally damaging situation in which civilians are the tools for war. We think that this gets worse under their side, and it does not abide by the definition of a war. It worsens the definition of a war crime, as opening government has already set free. But secondly, let's talk about the characterization of insurgency. They try to create a distinction between action and ideology, saying that you should not punish a person for an ideology, you should punish a person for their action. Guess what, Mr. Madam Speaker? We think that in a situation of modern warfare, ideology proliferation is something that is going to happen on both sides. The government is going to try to proliferate their ideology, so is the opposition. We think that people within the village are capable of making a decision that is in line with their ideology only when they recognize that as a result of their ideology, they can be harmed from either side. Because you understand that as a result of your choice, there will be harm coming from either side of the house, we think we make it easier for these civilians to recognize that you want to side with the side that you actually support, rather than the side that comes first. Because if you side, because regardless of what happens, you as a civilian know that at the point that, whether the army comes or whether the insurgents come, that you understand that you're going to be harmed. So we think it's more likely that the civilians are going to make decisions according to their ideological calculus. But secondly, let's talk about the concept of consequences. I'm going to divide this into two stakeholders. Firstly, army. Yes, opening.
Right, so the IRA was unfairly prosecuted during war for being people who were fighting for religion and forced youth violence. In your role, you would allow the government to literally kill any other civilian that sympathies towards the Protestant cause, even though there's an entirely legitimate political option.
We think that these civilians are going to make these choices no matter what happens. That is, we have to understand that these civilians have to choose between the government and the IRA when it comes to a battle that is happening in their own homes. In those situations, we think it's better that they get, even if they get killed by whoever it is, we think it's better that they get killed by whether they harbor someone or not, by whether they choose a particular ideology or not, rather than siding with whatever side that comes like to your ground first, or whatever side that is defending your ground first. We think that we make that choice much more easier when civilians understand that harm can be done by insurgents, but harm can also be done by the government. But secondly, let's talk going back, let's talk about how it changes the incentives of the army, because they talked about ideology proliferation and how that's going to protect the insurgents better. We think that at the point that this policy is passed, governments and nations also have to understand that it's not just about trying to kill the most number of people, but it's also about trying to convince people ideologically, to make sure that when enemy combatants come, these people are capable of saying, no, we don't want to protect you. We think that we make that much more easier on government side, because now the army has an active incentive to do that, to make sure that they are covering as many villages as possible, protecting as many of them as possible. This is a unique contribution coming from Closing Gov, but also let's talk about the incentive of the insurgents, because we also think that this was less dealt with in terms of the opening half of the debate. We think that we changed the incentives for insurgents as well, because as I've already stated formerly, we think insurgents come in not just for the food, not just for the bed, but because it's tactically useful to be there, because it's tactically useful to shield your town with villagers who might not necessarily know what they're doing. We think that at this point, insurgents are much less likely to do this, but even if they raid a village and claim civilians, we think that it's much less likely that they're going to use these civilians as tools for negotiation, as tools for blackmail. We think that this degrades the legitimacy of insurgents, but moreover, we think that it lessens the likelihood of them being there in the first place. That's why CJ takes this debate. Thank you.
Thank you. The governing whip. Now, the last speaker of this debate, opposition.
May I begin? Mr. Speaker, we think that closing opposition today are the ones that recognize the context of warfare, that especially when embarking upon the 22nd century, wars are becoming more and more dangerous, that technologies involving drones and nuclear warfare is involving, and countries are becoming more and more isolationist, that wars are generally becoming more brutal and more dangerous. Seeing this, we think that the job of a government is to keep the regulations solidified, that to keep the values of humanity solidified, not to lax regulations on war crimes, not to lax regulations on human rights. We think that is the dignity that people deserve. Because we don't think that the job of a soldier is to kill as many people as possible. Rather, it is their job to end wars effectively. While they're worried about making the definition of war crimes trivial, they're trivializing the very value of human life, the very existence of human life. We think that is a greater problem, that is a greater burden on their side. First, let's talk about what closing government talked about. So let's talk about harboring, right? The very definition of harboring. We have two levels of analysis onto this. First of all, we don't think that all citizens who harbor are, first of all, willing to harbor in the first place, because in the shoes of the civilians, when they're suddenly invaded by a huge group of intruders, of insurgents, you have no defense mechanism, you have no ability and capability to defend yourself. That itself is not a just war to begin with, because their comparative is to try and encourage these innocent civilians with no defense mechanism to try and combat these insurgents. Please recognize that there is no option of refusing to take the insurgents in. But second, no thank you. Even if they are willingly taking in the insurgents, we recognize that there's a clear moral distinction between those who fight and those who harbor. Why is this the case? Two reasons. Number one, either they take them in because they're offering them a political cause, because it was like a lottery. They were born into a huge and violent war. We don't think that they have any government support. We don't think that they have any reason to support the cause that they're in right now. Their life is utter crap. If these insurgents are offering them a political cause and they're offering to harbor them and provide them shelter, we think that's perfectly justifiable. They're not directly involved in the war. No, thank you. But second case is, they do support the political movement from the very get-go. But even in this case, we think we already dealt with why people who hold guns and people who offer food are just on principle different. We want them to answer the question, there's a difference between action and ideology, and that is because the burden shouldn't be on civilians to choose between whether they support this political cause so they're going to take them in, or whether they don't, so they're just going to try and deal with the insurgents and combat that themselves, or they're going to take them in and try to like deal with the consequences. Oh, I might get bombed by the bigger country tomorrow. We don't think that the burden should be on the civilians to choose this when they're fighting for their very lives, when they were born into the conflict, not by choice, not by will. We don't think it's dangerous to put civilians and soldiers on the same exact rank. But second, let's talk about war crime. No, thank you. We think, first of all, the government already has a clear incentive to make sure that innocent villages doesn't go to the opposing side. Why is that worsened under their side of the house? It is because when you as a civilian know that the opposing government is willing to bomb you because you had no choice but to take in these insurgents and they're willing to remove the dignity of your life, you have more the incentive to go to the opposing side and support that political cause. Human shields already exist in the status quo, and it is already tricky enough to distinguish who's involved in the war and who is not. But that is why it is ever more important to have a clear line, to have a clear difference between soldiers and innocent civilians, not blur that and say, oh, if you're somehow involved in this political cause, you're just as guilty, so we have the justification to bomb you anyway. Second, no thank you. Their alternative is to somehow bring in these governments, to bring massive manpower onto the land, to enlighten these people to be able to defend themselves from insurgents. They fail to explain to us, first of all, why governments have the incentive to do that, and second, why that is going to be cost efficient, why that is going to work. We don't think that is the reality of how war works. But at this point, I want to move on to the clashes of today's debate. Before I go on, I'll accept the opening.
Assuming that argument is true and there will be some real harm, then obviously the military won't do it because they recognize the harm. This debate is whether or not, if the net benefit is greater, why should we still continue this policy? Because, first of all, you fail to prove to us that there is a net benefit, because just because you wipe out one village, that doesn't mean the war is gone. You don't solve anything, you worsen the problem. But let's talk about why the condoning of such actions say about international values. And to do this, we first need to examine what is the purpose of war and what does war constitute. 3 levels. First of all, they seem to have an idea that war is still in the context of the medieval age, where the point is to kill as many people as possible. We refuse this very premise, because we think war is to defend and protect each respective party. And it's problematic when they use utilitarianism to dehumanize war and everyone involved. We think it is best to engage directly in the leadership, in the main parts of the battlefield involved, not take chances on random innocent villages and hope that war is somehow going to get better. No, thank you. Second, we recognize that war is just. That constitutes ideas of proportionality, of symmetrical warfare. We don't think that civilians in this case have this qualification because they have no capability to defend. They have no reason to suffice this war mechanism. They deserve to be protected because they are vulnerable actors. We don't think the option is to kill them. Third and lastly, we don't think that war is simply about killing the enemy side. We think there are a lot more to that. We think it's also about ensuring that the life afterwards of people upholds a better quality and a better security of life. At the point in which you would wipe out an entire village, first of all, that they assume that is the means to the end. We don't think that's the case. They're just simply worsening the warfare. But second, we don't consider it a success when you kill 49% to save the 51%. We already told you why there will be backlash, and we already told you why that is principally unjustified. But the exclusive extension coming from closing opposition was that you're regressing international values, right? Because we really want to evaluate that ever since the creation of organizations like the ICJ, like the ICC, like the Declaration of Human Rights was built, we think that we are having a trend in which society is willing to accept the values of humanity, because we are embarking on an age where war is going to be more dangerous, terrorism is on the rise, and countries need to stay solidified on the values of humanity. We think it is important to uphold these values because you, on the other hand, are being extremely regressive when you're willing to gamble with innocent people's lives and you're willing to challenge the very definition of international law that you have fought for previous decades. We are more than proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.